In 2016, I wrote to Amazon shareholders about what I call day two. I explained that day two is stasis. This is followed by irrelevance, then by excruciating and painful decline, and finally by death. That is why it is always day one at Amazon. Die one means customer obsession, high velocity decision making, and the willingness to embrace external trends even when they are uncomfortable. On October 1st, 2025, the United States government shut down. It remained closed for 43 days. This was the longest shutdown in American history. When it finally ended on November 12th, the Congressional Budget Office estimated between $7 billion and $14 billion in permanent economic losses. 670,000 federal workers were furloughed. 42 million Americans lost access to food assistance. Airlines canceled over 7,500 flights. The economy lost approximately $15 billion per week. Consumer sentiment plummeted to its lowest level since the pandemic, hitting 50.7 on the University of Michigan index. What I am watching unfold here is textbook day two behavior. I have seen exactly where that leads. Let me be clear, I am not talking about politics. I am talking about operations. This is about customer obsession versus political obsession. It is about high velocity decision making versus paralysis. It is also about working backwards from the customer versus working backwards from ideology. The data does not lie. The customers, in this case, American citizens who rely on government services, told us very clearly what they needed. For 43 days, the system optimized for the wrong metrics. This is a case study in what happens when an organization loses its day one mentality. The 2025 government shutdown violated every principle of customer-obsessed long-term thinking. The federal government is the ultimate service organization. Its customers are 330 million Americans. These citizens depend on it for everything from food assistance to air travel safety to national parks. When you shut that organization down for 43 days over a policy dispute, you are not making a high velocity decision. You are creating organizational paralysis. Here is what the data shows. This was not a two-way door decision that could be easily reversed. This was a one-way door. It is the kind of decision that demands careful consideration. This is because the consequences are permanent. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that $7 billion to $14 billion in economic activity will never be recovered. That is not temporary pain. That is permanent value destruction. At Amazon, we obsess over something we call the flywheel. Customer experience drives traffic, which attracts sellers, which expands selection, and which improves customer experience. It is a virtuous cycle. What happened during this shutdown was the exact opposite. It was a vicious cycle. Federal workers went without pay. This wrecked consumer spending, which hurt small businesses. It also damaged the economy and made federal workers even more anxious about their futures. Trust, the most valuable asset in any relationship, was systematically destroyed. This matters for three reasons. First, trust is a balance sheet asset. It is hard to build, easy to lose, and almost impossible to regain. In 1997, I wrote that we would focus obsessively on earning and keeping customer trust. Every decision since then has been filtered through that lens. 42 million Americans depending on supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits could not get food. Federal workers missed paychecks, flights were canceled. This destroyed trust. You cannot optimize for short-term political wins and expect to maintain long-term institutional trust. Second, this demonstrates classic day two, symptoms. These symptoms include decision-making paralysis, There is a focus on process over results. Political positions are used as proxies for actual customer outcomes. Organizational stasis is also evident when a junior leader defends a bad outcome by saying they followed their principles. That is day two thinking. An experienced leader uses bad outcomes as opportunities to investigate and improve the process. Third, the flywheel effects are devastating. Every day the shutdown continued, the negative flywheel spun faster. Workers became more demoralized. Economic damage compounded. Trust eroded further. Small businesses lost access to $4.5 billion in small business administration loans. National parks deteriorated. Immigration hearings were delayed. The impacts cascade and multiply. That is what flywheels do. Let us look at the data. The data from this shutdown is unambiguous. Let me walk you through the numbers, because at Amazon, we always start with the data. Economic impact. $7 to $14 billion in permanent gross domestic product losses. The Congressional Budget Office released 3 scenarios before the shutdown ended. A 4-week shutdown would cost $7 billion permanently. A 6-week shutdown would cost $11 billion. An 8-week shutdown would cost $14 billion. We ended up at 43 days. This placed it right in that 6-week window. That is $11 billion in economic value that will never be recovered. It was not delayed. It was not postponed. It was permanently lost. For context, that is roughly equivalent to Amazon's entire quarterly capital expenditure. It is gone. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the shutdown reduced annualized gross domestic product growth. This occurred in the fourth quarter of 2025. The reduction was by 1.0 to 2.0 percentage points. The economy was already showing signs of strain, including sluggish hiring, elevated inflation, and tariff uncertainty. This situation was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Customer impact. 42 million Americans lost food assistance. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program faced a critical funding shortage by day 20 of the shutdown. The United States Department of Agriculture warned that approximately 42 million Americans could lose food assistance. This would happen if the shutdown continued into November. Think about that number. That is more than the population of California. These are customers, American citizens who depend on a service they had been promised. The shutdown delayed $8 billion in monthly supplemental nutrition assistance program payments, creating immediate financial disruption for the most vulnerable households. At Amazon, if we promised 2-day delivery and failed to deliver for 42 million customers, we would be out of business. The social contract is the same. The government promised a service. It failed to deliver. Workforce chaos. 1.4 million federal employees were affected. Approximately 670,000 federal workers were furloughed without pay. Another 730,000 were classified as essential and had to work without knowing when they would get paid. The Trump administration threatened mass firings. It attempted to lay off 4,100 probationary federal employees. A federal judge blocked this action. This creates precisely the kind of organizational chaos that defines day 2. Here is what makes this operationally catastrophic. Federal workers make up 5.5% of Maryland's workforce. They encompass 2.9% of New Mexico's. They also make up 2.6% of Oklahoma's and 3.8% of Alaska's workforce. When you do not pay these workers, entire regional economies seize up, consumer spending drops, small businesses suffer. The flywheel starts spinning in reverse. Air travel disruption. More than 7,500 flights were canceled. Air traffic controllers, who are classified as essential workers, had to work without pay. By the end of the shutdown, staffing shortages forced the Federal Aviation Administration to cut scheduled flights. This reduced flights by 6% at 40 major airports. Over 7,500 flights were canceled or delayed. This echoes the 2018 to 2019 shutdown. Overworked controllers at LaGuardia temporarily halted incoming flights. This crisis helped force that shutdown's end. The economic damage here extends far beyond inconvenienced travelers. Airlines estimate each canceled flight costs roughly $50,000 to $75,000. This cost includes crew expenses, rebooking, and lost productivity. Consider the calculations. 7,500 flights multiplied by $50,000 equals $375 million minimum. This does not include the cascading effects on hotels, rental cars, and conferences. It also does not include lost family visits and business deals that did not happen. Small business strangulation. $4.5 billion in loan access was denied. The Small Business Administration could not distribute $170 million per day in federally guaranteed loans. Over the course of the shutdown, that is $4.5 billion in capital. More than 8,300 small businesses could not access these funds. These are the companies that drive job creation and economic dynamism. When you choke off their capital access for 43 days, you do not just delay their growth. Instead, you kill businesses that were on the margin. Consumer confidence collapse, 50.7 sentiment index. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index dropped to 50.7 in November. This was the lowest level since the pandemic era inflation spike. This spike occurred in 2022. Consumer spending represents about 2/3 of United States economic activity. When confidence craters like this, spending follows. This is not just a sentiment problem. This is a leading indicator of real economic contraction. Museum and park closures. Millions of visitors were turned away. The Smithsonian Museums, research centers, and National Zoo closed on October 1st. National parks stopped trash collection, road maintenance, and visitor services. Washington, District of Columbia, already experiencing 6% unemployment before the shutdown, saw tourism revenue collapse. For context, national park visitors contribute $42 billion annually to the United States economy. For every day parks are closed, that is about $115 million in lost economic activity. The data is screaming at us. Every metric that matters, including economic output, customer satisfaction, workforce stability, and trust, moved in the wrong direction. This is what happens when you optimize for political positioning instead of customer outcomes. This reminds me of something. In 1999, I was facing a very similar decision. Not in scale, obviously, but in principle. Amazon was burning cash. Our stock had soared during the dot-com boom. We hit $107 per share in December 1999, but by 2001, we had dropped to $6. More than 90% of our value had evaporated. Pets.com and Webvan and dozens of other online retailers were going bankrupt around us. Wall Street was screaming at us to become profitable immediately. They demanded we cut costs. They demanded we stop expanding. They wanted us to show quarterly earnings. They demanded it now. Here is what we could have done. We could have slashed research and development spending. We could have stopped expanding our product selection. We could have cut back on customer service. We could have shown a profit in the next quarter. Wall Street would have loved it. Our stock might have stabilized. And Amazon would have died within 5 years. Instead, we asked a different question. What does the customer need long term? We looked at our actual operational metrics. not our stock price, not analyst opinions, and not political pressure. We measured customer satisfaction, which hit record highs. We measured cash flow, which was improving. We measured selection expansion and Prime member growth and delivery speed improvements. The inputs we could control were all moving in the right direction, so we made a one-way door decision. We would continue investing aggressively in customer experience. We did this even as we bled money. We optimized for cash flow rather than generally accepted accounting principles earnings. We took a long-term view. By the end of 2000, we had borrowed $2 billion from banks. Our cash balance had dipped to just $350 million. We closed distribution centers. We laid off 14% of our workforce. That was painful but necessary. It ensured the company survived to serve customers long term. But here's the crucial difference. Every painful decision we made was in service of the customer. We did not stop investing in customer experience. We did not stop adding selection. We did not stop making Prime better. We cut costs that did not serve customers and doubled down on everything that did. The shutdown did the opposite. It inflicted maximum pain on customers. This included federal workers, supplemental nutrition assistance program recipients, air travelers, and small business owners. This occurred while optimizing for political leverage. That is not long-term thinking. That is not customer obsession. That is day two. By 2002, Amazon reached our first profitable quarter. We launched Amazon Web Services. We introduced Prime. We built the Kindle. All because we refused to optimize for short-term metrics at the expense of long-term customer value. Today, Amazon Web Services alone generates over $90 billion in annual revenue. Prime has over 200 million members. The flywheel continued to turn. The flywheel that nearly stopped spinning in 1999 has become one of the most powerful business engines ever created. The lesson is simple. When you face a crisis, you optimize for the customer, not for short-term appearances. You measure the inputs you can control. These include selection, price, convenience, and trust. You execute relentlessly on those. You do not hold the customer hostage while you argue about strategy. At Amazon, we are obsessed with the concept of the flywheel. It is simple in theory, but powerful in practice. Customer experience drives traffic. This attracts sellers, which expands selection. Expanded selection improves customer experience, which drives more traffic. Each element reinforces the others, get it spinning, and growth becomes nearly automatic. However, it also works in reverse, and that is what happened during the shutdown. Let me show you how the negative flywheel worked here. During the first 5 days, trust erosion began. Federal workers did not receive expected paychecks. Consumer confidence started dropping as people realized this was not a symbolic gesture. Real services were stopping. The first rotation of the negative flywheel was broken promises, leading to reduced trust. During the next 10 days, economic contraction accelerated. Workers who missed their first paycheck started cutting spending. They skipped meals, deferred bills, and used credit cards for gas just to get to work. Consumer spending, representing 2/3 of gross domestic product, began to decline. Small businesses lost access to $170 million each day in small business administration loans. The flywheel spun. Regis spending, Regis business confidence. This Regis investment, which Regis growth, which further Regis spending. From day 16 to day 25, system failures cascaded. Supplemental nutrition assistance program funding ran dry. 42 million Americans could not access food assistance. Air traffic controllers working without pay started calling in sick. Flights were canceled, museums closed, and national parks deteriorated. The government data that the Federal Reserve needed to make monetary policy decisions stopped flowing. Each failure compounded the previous one. The flywheel accelerated, service failures increased anxiety. This increased political pressure, which increased intransigence and further increased service failures. During days 26 through 43, institutional damage became permanent. The Congressional Budget Office started reporting permanent gross domestic product losses. Federal workers who were threatened with mass firings began looking for private sector jobs. Trust in government institutions, which was already low, cratered further. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index hit 50.7. The negative flywheel was now spinning so fast, it was self-sustaining. Institutional damage drove talent loss. This drove operational failures, which drove more institutional damage. This is the nightmare scenario for any large organization. Once the flywheel starts spinning in the wrong direction, every day makes it harder to reverse. The momentum builds against you. Compare this to Amazon's flywheel during our crisis years. Our stock price crashed, we laid off workers, analysts predicted our bankruptcy. However, the customer experience flywheel never stopped. Selection kept expanding. Prices kept dropping. Delivery kept getting faster. Customer satisfaction kept rising. When we emerged from the crisis, the flywheel was still spinning in our favor. We had momentum to build on. The shutdown destroyed momentum. When it ended, the government did not snap back to normal operations. Smithsonian museums reopened on a staggered schedule. Flight disruptions continued for days. Federal workers returned demoralized and anxious. Small businesses that closed during the shutdown stayed closed. The flywheel does not just restart. You have to spin it back up from a standstill, fighting against all the negative momentum you have built. This teaches us something about complex systems. Trust and momentum are your most valuable assets because they are the hardest to rebuild. Stock prices recover, warehouses get rebuilt. However, trust and momentum take years to restore once you have destroyed them. You destroy them very, very quickly when you optimize for the wrong metrics. This highlights one of my core operational philosophies. You cannot control outputs, but you can control inputs. Let me explain what I mean. At Amazon, we do not obsess over profit margins or stock prices. Those are outputs. We obsess over selection, price, and convenience. Those are inputs we can actually control. If we get the inputs right, the outputs take care of themselves. If we get them wrong, no amount of financial engineering will save us. The shutdown revealed a catastrophic failure to understand this distinction. What they were measuring were outputs. They measured political leverage, asking who would blink first. They monitored media coverage, assessing if they were winning the narrative. They watched poll numbers, considering who was getting blamed. They prioritized partisan solidarity, checking if their coalition was holding. These are all lagging indicators. They tell you what already happened. They cannot be directly controlled. Optimizing for them leads to organizational paralysis. This is because there is always another poll, another media cycle, and another political calculation. What they should have been measuring were inputs. They should have measured federal worker stability, such as how many were looking for other jobs. They should have tracked customer satisfaction to see if citizens were getting needed services. They should have monitored economic activity, such as whether gross domestic product was growing or contracting. They should have used trust metrics to see if people believed the government kept its promises. They should have assessed service delivery, checking if core functions operate reliably. These are leading indicators. They tell you what is coming. They can be controlled through deliberate action. Optimizing for them creates organizational velocity because you always know what to do next. That is, improve the inputs. Let me give you a concrete example from Amazon. In the early 2000s, when we were struggling, we could have measured our success by quarterly earnings. That is what Wall Street wanted. However, earnings are an output. They lag behind the real drivers of the business. Instead, we measured customer satisfaction scores, which at the time were hitting record highs. We measured free cash flow, which was improving. We also measured selection expansion, delivery speed, and defect rates. These inputs told us we were building something valuable. This was true even as the output metrics, such as stock price and profitability, looked terrible. We were right. The outputs eventually followed the inputs. The shutdown did the opposite. Political leaders optimized for output metrics such as poll numbers, political positioning, and media wins. They ignored the input metrics that actually matter. Federal worker satisfaction was collapsing, but they did not measure it. Customer trust was evaporating, but they did not track it. Small business formation was stalling, but they did not monitor it. Here is the brutal truth. When you manage outputs instead of inputs, you create the conditions for day two. You start managing to proxies. The process becomes the thing. You defend bad outcomes by saying that you held your principles. That is not customer obsession. That is organizational sclerosis. At Amazon, when we see a bad customer experience metric, we do not ask how we can explain this. We ask what input we failed to optimize. If delivery times spike, we do not blame external factors. We examine our logistics, our inventory placement, and our carrier relationships. We fix the inputs and the outputs improve automatically. The government needed to ask what inputs would minimize a harm to customers. The immediate answer was to end the shutdown and negotiate from a position of government operations. However, that requires accepting a short-term political loss to preserve long-term institutional health. That trade-off should be obvious, but day two organizations consistently get it wrong. At Amazon, we spend a lot of time thinking about doors. Specifically, we categorize the decisions into two types. These are one-way doors and two-way doors. A two-way door is a decision you can reverse. For example, if you launch a new product feature and customers hate it, you can roll it back. If you try a new marketing approach and it fails, you can stop it. Two-way doors allow for high-velocity decision-making because the cost of being wrong is low. You can course correct quickly. A one-way door is different. It is a decision that is hard or impossible to reverse. For example, if you acquire a company, fire 14% of your workforce, or fundamentally change your business model, these require careful analysis because you cannot easily undo them. You have to get them mostly right the first time. The critical mistake organizations make, especially day two organizations, is treating one-way doors like two-way doors, or vice versa. You either rush through one-way doors without proper analysis, or you agonize over two-way doors and create decision paralysis. The government shutdown was a one-way door treated like a two-way door. Here is why it was a one-way door. The economic damage, $7 billion to $14 billion in permanent gross domestic product losses, cannot be recovered. Those small businesses that close will not reopen. Federal workers who found private sector jobs will not return. The trust destroyed cannot be magically restored. Consumer confidence that cratered will take months or years to rebuild. Every day, the shutdown continued, more permanent damage accumulated. The Congressional Budget Office was explicit about this in their analysis. They said most of the gross domestic product decline would eventually be recovered. However, between $7 billion and $14 billion would not. That is the definition of a one-way door. You cannot go back through and reclaim that value. Yet political leaders treated it like a two-way door. They assumed they could shut the government down. They believed they could wait for political pressure to build, reach a deal, and then everything would snap back to normal. That is two-way door thinking applied to a one-way door decision. It is categorically wrong. Let me contrast this with Amazon's approach When we were deciding whether to launch Amazon Web Services, that was a one-way door. We were committing billions of dollars to build data centers for a product that did not exist yet. This was in a market we had never competed in, serving customers who did not know they needed it. We could not launch Amazon Web Services, see if it worked, and then simply say, never mind if it failed. The capital commitment was irreversible. So what did we do? We spent years analyzing the decision. We built prototypes and talked to potential customers. We modeled different scenarios and made sure we understood the risks. Then once we committed, we executed with full conviction. That is proper one-way door decision-making. However, when we are deciding whether to add a new feature to the Amazon website, that is a two-way door. We launch it quickly, measure customer response, and iterate. If it does not work, we remove it. There is no drama or agonizing analysis. It is just high-velocity experimentation. The shutdown reversed this logic. Leaders rushed into a one-way door decision. They shut down the entire federal government without properly analyzing the consequences. Then, once they were through the door, they moved with excruciating slowness. They treated every negotiation point like it required another round of careful consideration. They were fast where they should have been slow, and slow where they should have been fast. Here is the framework we use at Amazon to distinguish between door types. One-way door indicators include consequences that are irreversible or extremely costly to reverse, decisions that affect core operations or customer trust, large financial or organizational commitments, and the potential for existential failure. Two-way door indicators include ease of reversal if wrong, limited downside risk, availability of fast feedback loops, and failure that is a learning opportunity rather than a crisis. The shutdown was one way on every dimension. Its consequences included irreversible economic damage. Its effect was shattered trust in core government services. Its scale affected 42 million supplemental nutrition assistance program recipients, 1.4 million federal workers, and the entire United States economy. The failure risk involved institutional damage that compounded over time. The correct approach for a one-way door of this magnitude is not to go through it in the first place. Instead, find two-way door alternatives. Set up continuing resolutions while you negotiate, fund critical services while you debate policy, create reversible options that allow for high-velocity iteration without risking permanent damage. Instead, political leaders rushed through a one-way door. They could not reverse course once they saw the damage. This created 43 days of compounding harm. It is a masterclass in how not to make high-stakes decisions. At Amazon, we are paranoid about one-way doors. We slow down, we analyze, and we get multiple perspectives. We also scenario plan. We know that once you are, through a one-way door, you are committed to dealing with whatever is on the other side. If the analysis was incorrect, the organization becomes stuck. The shutdown proved exactly why that paranoia is justified. Let us tell you what day 2 actually looks like. I have been warning about it for nearly 3 decades, and this shutdown is a textbook example. In my 2016 shareholder letter, I described day 2 by stating that day 2 is stasis. Irrelevance follows. This is followed by excruciating and painful decline. Death eventually follows. For these reasons, the focus must always remain on day 1. Day 2 does not announce itself with sirens. It creeps in gradually. Organizations do not suddenly become bureaucratic and ineffective. Instead, they drift there slowly, making small compromises and optimizing for the wrong metrics. They manage to proxies instead of results. One day, organizations realize they have become like Sears, Kmart, or Borders. These are examples of dozens of companies that dominated their industries and then vanished The shutdown exhibited every classic day two symptom. A primary symptom is decision-making paralysis. For 43 days, no decision was made. The facts were not unclear. The economic damage was mounting daily. The Congressional Budget Office was issuing warnings, and federal workers were suffering. Instead, the decision-making process had become sclerotic. Each side waited for the other to blink. Political ejaculations superseded operational reality. The organization became incapable of acting, even in the face of obvious harm to its customers. At Amazon, we follow a principle. Most decisions should be made with about 70% of the information you wish you had. If you wait for 90%, you are probably too slow. You need to be good at recognizing and correcting bad decisions quickly. However, that requires action. The shutdown was the opposite. There was 100% paralysis despite overwhelming evidence about the right course of action. Another symptom is placing process over results. This is perhaps the most insidious day two symptom. Good process serves you so you can serve customers. However, if you are not watchful, the process becomes the thing itself. The process becomes the proxy for the result you want. You stop looking at outcomes and just make sure the process is being done correctly. It is not rare to hear a junior leader defend a bad outcome. For example, junior leaders might say, they followed the process. That is exactly what happened here. They claimed to hold to their principles. They stated they did not compromise their values. They insisted they followed their constitutional prerogatives. These are process defenses for outcome failures. A more experienced leader uses bad outcomes as opportunities to investigate and improve the process. The outcome here was catastrophic. It resulted in $11 billion in permanent economic damage. 42 million people lost food assistance and 1.4 million workers went without pay. However, leaders defended these outcomes by pointing to their adherence to process and principle. That is day two thinking. Results do not matter, only whether the approved procedure was followed. Third symptom involves proxies replacing reality. As companies get larger and more complex, there is a tendency to manage to proxies. Poll numbers became a proxy for customer satisfaction. Media coverage became a proxy for operational effectiveness. Political solidarity became a proxy for good governance. However, proxies are dangerous because they are second-order effects, not the thing itself. At Amazon, we could manage to our stock price. That is a proxy for business health. However, we do not, because the stock price is on output, not on input. We manage to customer satisfaction, operational efficiency, and innovation. These are the actual drivers of long-term value. When you manage to proxies, you optimize for the wrong things and get surprising results. The shutdown optimized for political proxies while the actual operational metrics collapsed. It is like optimizing for your Yelp rating while your restaurant serves spoiled food. Eventually, reality catches up with the proxy. Organizational stasis and risk aversion also become prevalent. Day two organizations become risk averse. They stop innovating, they stop experimenting. They defend what they have rather than building what is next. However, stasis is invisible until it is too late. Think about Sears. In the 1990s, Sears was America's largest retailer. They had the real estate, the brand, the customer relationships, and the supply chain infrastructure. They should have invented Amazon. They had every advantage. Instead, they became risk averse. They managed to quarterly earnings instead of customer experience. They optimized for maintaining existing business lines instead of building new ones. They fell into day two, and by the time they realized it, Amazon had eaten their lunch. Or consider Borders. They were neck and neck with Barnes & Noble in the late 1990s. They had a chance to build their own online bookstore. Instead, they outsourced their web presence to Amazon. This decision was a significant one. They were so focused on protecting their existing store-based model that they handed their future to a competitor. That is day two thinking. By 2011, Borders was bankrupt. The shutdown revealed the same pattern. Rather than innovate on governance, leaders fell back on the same playbook that has been failing for decades. This would include finding new ways to negotiate, creating continuing resolutions, and building safety valves into the system. Government shutdowns do not work. We know this. The 2018 and 2019 shutdown did not achieve its policy goals. The 2013 shutdown damaged both parties politically. However, institutional inertia is powerful. Day two organizations keep doing what they have always done, even when it clearly does not work. External trends are also ignored or resisted. Day two organizations resist external trends. They see changes in the market or technology or society, and they either ignore them or fight them. Day one organizations embrace external trends eagerly, even when they are uncomfortable. The external trends here were clear. Consumer confidence was collapsing. Economic growth was slowing. The job market was weakening. Tariff uncertainty was creating business paralysis. Adding a government shutdown to this environment was like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. Any external analysis would have said that this is the worst possible time to create additional economic disruption. However, day two organizations do not adapt to external trends. They plow ahead with their predetermined plans, regardless of changing circumstances. That is organizational rigidity, and it is fatal in a dynamic environment. At Amazon, when we saw the rise of cloud computing, we did not fight it. We embraced it and built Amazon Web Services. When we saw that customers wanted faster delivery, we did not defend our existing logistics network. We built a new one with Prime. When we saw the shift to mobile, we did not cling to desktop. We rebuilt our entire experience for mobile-first customers. That is day one thinking. It means embracing external trends, even when they require massive organizational change. The shutdown ignored every external trend pointing towards caution. That is day two. Let us discuss the most valuable asset any organization has. That asset is trust. Trust is your balance sheet asset that does not appear on the balance sheet. It is accumulated slowly through thousands of interactions where you keep your promises. It is destroyed quickly, sometimes in a single interaction where you break them. At Amazon, I point to the exact moment when I understood how valuable trust is. It was the late 1990s, and we were struggling with inventory management. Customers would order books that we listed as available, but then we would have to inform them the book was actually backordered. We broke our promise each time it happened. We lost a little bit of trust, so we built better inventory systems. We got fanatical about accuracy. We underpromised and overdelivered. Slowly, over years, we rebuilt that trust. Today, when Amazon states on item is available, customers believe it. That trust took a decade to build. It can be destroyed in a day. The shutdown was systematic trust destruction. Federal worker trust was shattered during the shutdown. Imagine you are a federal employer. You have dedicated your career to public service. You show up to work every day knowing you could probably earn more in the private sector. However, you believe in the mission. You believe the United States government will keep its promise to pay you for your work. Then on October 1st, 2025, that promise is broken. You are either furloughed without pay, or you are deemed essential and forced to work without knowing when you will get paid. This continued for 43 days. During that time, your employer, the United States government, threatens to furlough you. It also threatens to fire you permanently as part of a reduction in force. How do you feel about your employer after that? Do you trust them to keep future promises? Do you recommend government service to your talented friends and family members? Or do you start looking for private sector jobs? This is how you destroy an institution from the inside. Federal workers surveyed during the shutdown reported they felt their agency had lost their trust. News coverage repeatedly used the phrase, taking civil servants hostage. Workers cut back on meals, deferred bills, and racked up credit card debt just to buy gas to get to work. One worker, Jessica Sweet, told reporters that it shakes the foundation of trust that we all place in our agencies and in the federal government to do the right thing. Trust was destroyed. Here is the thing about destroyed trust. It does not come back quickly, and sometimes it does not come back at all. The federal government will be dealing with recruiting and retention challenges for years because of this shutdown. Talented people will choose private sector careers instead. The brain drain will be gradual, but real. Another consequence is customer lifetime value erosion. At Amazon, we think about customer lifetime value, which is the total value a customer generates over their entire relationship with us. It is not about the current transaction. It is about whether the customer comes back next time and the time after that and the time after that. The United States government services work the same way. When citizens pay taxes, they are not just paying for this year's services. They are investing in a system they expect will be there when they need it. This includes food assistance if they lose their job. It also includes Social Security when they retire, air traffic control when they fly, and national parks when they want to visit. The shutdown told 42 million Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program recipients that the system they've been paying into might not be there when they need it. It told federal workers that their labor and dedication might not be reciprocated. It told small business owners that the Small Business Administration loans they depend on might disappear at any moment. It told air travelers that flight safety might be compromised due to political disputes. Each of these messages erodes trust, and eroded trust means people disengage from the system. They stop believing in the social contract. They stop participating fully. They look for alternatives. In business terms, you have reduced customer lifetime value, and that has compounding negative effects on your growth trajectory.